So I'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this next session of the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. This session is titled Aligning State Advocacy with Federal Opportunities, and I'm really excited to be hosting it with you. I am working with my colleague here at the partnership, Sean Gio, our policy director. I would like to thank our sponsor for this session, Penrose. We are so grateful for all of the sponsors at the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. They really allow us to be able to continue to do this every year and to do it virtually so we can bring it to as many people as possible. And we're so grateful for their support. I am going to kick it off today as a moderator, and I'm so happy to be joined by some great colleagues that I've gotten to know over the last year from the New England Housing Network. And Sean, I don't know if you have the ability to pin people, but that would be great if we can pin the speakers. So I'd like to welcome my co-presenters here from the New England Housing Network. First, we're going to hear from Polly Major. She is the Director of Policy and Special Projects at Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. Laura Mitchell is the Executive Director of the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition. Nick Taylor is the Director at Housing Action New Hampshire. And Nancy Owens is president and co-founder of Evernorth, a nonprofit that develops affordable housing projects and investments, and they do work in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. I'd like to add that Rhode Island is also a member of the New England Housing Network and is often represented by Brenda Clement, who is the director of Housing Works Rhode Island at Roger Williams University, but Brenda was not able to join us this morning. So I think first I'm mentioning the New England Housing Network, and some of you may be wondering what that is. So I'm going to start us off with Nancy to give us a brief history of the New England Housing Network and tell us how we got to kind of this place today, and then Polly will bring us up to speed a little bit more in what we've been doing most recently. But Nancy, can you give us an overview of how the New England Housing Network got started?
Yeah, I'll give it a try. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you here virtually. So I dug back in the archives a little bit to just learn for myself. I've been active in housing my entire career and have been in northern New England for the past 30 years. So I have some notes to draw on, and what I found was that the New England Housing Network has been around since 1995, so 30 years. And when I look back at some of those early sessions, there's very familiar names. The same groups and organizations have been engaged in this conversation since that time. The primary organizations and participants have include really those affordable housing coalitions and membership organizations that are active in the 6 states. And CHAPA has been New England Housing Network's home at least since 2002, but I think right from the start.
Can you just say who CHAPA is real quick, Nancy, for those of
Yeah,
us who might not know?
Community Housing and Planning Association, I think is everybody just calls it CHAPA, but that is the policy and planning organization based in Massachusetts, and has been really a key player in organizing policy and other work in Massachusetts. Is a membership organization, runs conferences similar, to your group here, and but they have been the glue that has held New England Housing Network together and supported and been the kind of key organization to support the rest of us to organize. And we organized, and I think just to make that point, we organized because we saw the power and the opportunity to influence housing policy at the federal level. Primarily was our goal, is focus on federal policy. by bringing our collective voices together, right? To communicate with our, 6 congressional delegations, all those senators and representatives. And I have to say that actually is fairly revolutionary. There aren't that many coalitions like this made up of a regional multi-state effort. And when we've gone, the feedback that we've consistently gotten over the years is that this joint advocacy within a region is unusual and impactful, and that our little 6 states have a lot in common, which is the other reason that we joined together, whether that's the demographics of the region, the economics, kind of the social history, the housing issues, of course, and that working together has been a really effective way for us to have our voice heard. The signature action that we've taken over this 30 years has been to make an annual trip to DC and visit in person as a group, with the delegation, their staff, and some agencies. And while there, to just like present a united front on our case on what the key housing issues are and what kind of assistance that we're looking for and what things we're advocating for. So visiting, the same, again, places we're still doing, whether that's Senate Baking or Senate Appropriations or the subcommittees like THUD, Rural Development, Housing and Financial Services, agencies like, the USDA, Rural Development, of course, HUD, and sometimes Treasury. And the topics also have been unchanging at the broad level, right? We're interested in preservation issues, new production issues, homelessness, services, and programs that support all of that activity, the Section 8 program, the low-income housing tax credit program, rural housing programs, home, CDBG, and housing trust fund. So we've just consistently, except for a little break there during COVID, been very regularly engaged. And as I said, with that signature event of with the visit, during the rest of the year, we meet regularly, usually monthly. Sometimes we'll get together during the year a second time, either via another conference or some other gathering that's happening. But we're gathering shared data, shared information, and just sharing what's going on in our state so that we can learn from each other and work on some good policies. So sometimes that, and we'll talk a little bit about this, sometimes that shows up with letters or policy positions that we'll write and have done in the past, and covering kind of key issues and key topics. So it has a long history. We keep doing it because it's effective, and it's fun, and glad to be working with partners from around the region. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And I should have mentioned in the beginning that the New England Housing Network was kind of co-founded or started with CHAPA in Massachusetts, and the CHAPA representative couldn't be here today, but it's been, and that the partnership, we are also we are the representatives from Connecticut within the network, so it's been I think a benefit to all of us to be getting together in these ways, both virtually and in person, as well as going down to DC, and we'll hear a little bit more about that later from Nick, I think, but really appreciate that bit of history. And I'm going to turn it over to Polly to maybe bring us up to speed a little bit more in more current times. And can you share what we've been up to more recently and how things may have shifted?
Well, it's really wonderful to be here today and wonderful to be with my colleagues from across the New England Housing Network. Polly Major, I'm the Director of Policy and Special Projects for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And we've been a member of the New England Housing Network all along. And one of the, I think, really real strengths of this network is it brings together the New England states, but also organizations that represent membership advocacy organizations from across the states. Evernorth, led by Nancy, is a development partner that really has that strong development background, so knows how these projects are working and the implications of these federal programs. And then VHCB also works as a funder of affordable housing, and we administer some of these federal programs. So it's not just geographically diverse, but it's also diverse perspectives on how federal programs work together to support housing and people getting housed across New England. I come to this work both now working for a membership organization or an organization that's a member of the New England Housing Network, but I also first met the network as when I worked on Senator Leahy's staff covering housing for him. And so remember in that role, meeting with the network and as a congressional staffer, deeply valued a network that I could meet with that I knew there was going to be an expert in the room on any aspect of housing, which is such a sprawling public policy field. And to have just one group that you could go to that would have that expertise was really valuable, and I hope continues to be valuable for the staffers that we meet with. As Nancy said, long history of this group, a long history of organizations working together, but we took a break, a pause during COVID, as I think all of our organizations got really, really busy with both the immense challenge of keeping people housed through the pandemic and the opportunities of investing federal dollars in building housing. Coming out of the pandemic, we really rejuvenated the network, and Nick will talk about the first trip back to DC that we've made together in some years. But our priorities moving forward, we started meeting again, I think, shortly before the transition to the Trump administration. And when we were looking at declining federal resources just from the end of COVID stimulus and trying to wrap our heads around what that meant for our states in terms of housing production, but also in a moment of time when there was a lot of interest in land use reform and regulatory relief for housing. So how could we kind of bring these two advocacy pieces together at the federal level? Then the administration changed, the federal funding outlook changed dramatically, and I'm just so grateful that we reorganized in this moment so that we're able to share information about what we're hearing from our state's delegations, what we're seeing on the ground in terms of the impact of changes in federal programs, and to jointly advocate and jointly problem solve together. So in going back to DC, our priorities have stayed very consistent, that we are not just advocating for the capital for housing production or for rental assistance or for services, not just for urban programs or rural programs, but we're really emphasizing where these are working together. So that's been what Amy has just pulled up here is our white paper laying out the priorities for the New England Housing Network. And so we've had consistent membership, consistent priorities, but new urgency. And also, I'd say, while the organizations are the same, new faces. And it's so valuable to get to meet colleagues in different states, form those relationships, and know that if I have kind of curiosity about what Massachusetts is doing on land use reform because of some issues I'm seeing come up in Vermont, I can reach out to Matt as a resource. Or if I want to know what Maine is doing on permanent supportive housing, I can reach out to Laura or to another member from Maine, Colin Ryan, and learn more there. So it's valuable in that respect. And I think we'll talk more about that. But I want to maybe wrap up my piece so that we can hear from Nick about our trip to DC a couple of months ago.
Thank you so much, Polly. Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And I share through my colleagues' appreciation for the work that they all are doing in their states, the ability to have these shared conversations, and for the work that you all are doing in your communities to make a difference. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that information sort of feeds up and how it informs the conversations that we are having down in DC or across our states or with our policymakers. But as has been talked about, one of the big benefits of being a regional coalition with the 6 states and our broad delegations is these trips down to DC and being able to meet with key stakeholders. And so this fall we traveled down on September 10th and 11th, and using that regional voice and the fact that we were coming down as a group and not just any one individual organization, we were able to meet with HUD, meet with USDA, the Office of Management and Budget, the House Financial Services Committee, the Appropriations Committee, the Banking Committee in both the Senate and the House. And so we were able to meet with real high level decision makers and policy makers in these organizations and share what was going on. And they were arranged by some longtime members of the New England Housing Network who had existing relationships, our organizations, and then we also had a regional consultant who was helping us, who had also been part of the network and had worked for Senator Sanders for a long time, to be able to help make introductions and keep us all on track as we were all going down. But what Polly and Nancy both shared about the policy expertise amongst the group was incredibly important, because we're going into each of these meetings with a game plan about what we wanted to bring up in the limited amount of time, who was gonna bring that up, who could speak with their experience or their issue knowledge to bring up these key policy questions. And again, these were being informed by folks like you all who are on the ground, who are dealing with challenges, whether it's with federal funding or administrative rules and barriers that feed up through these organizations, through our organizations, and able to bring it right to the table with kind of key decision makers. And so on a big picture level, for some of the takeaways, Paul mentioned there's a lot of interest in regulatory and administrative reform and being able to share some of those barriers. There's also obviously a lot of uncertainty around some of the capital programs and potential changes. And so we were able to we found that staff were listening very intently, that were asking good questions, that they I think really were interested in how programs were being implemented on the ground. I think you often hear about sort of like the DC bubble and folks not being able to sort of get out into the states and being able to get out into the communities about how these policies are affecting people on the ground. And I think there was a real broad interest across the committee staff and the administration staff of hearing, what was going on and how these were showing up and what did it mean for housing development or homeless services, shelter or voucher administration, all of that. There was a real interest in hearing true stories about the work that they were doing every day and how that was showing up in the communities. And Laura will talk a little bit to some sort of specific follow-ups and some pieces there. But the fact that we were able to bring these stories, that we were able to provide then feedback on proposed legislation, and they were asking for our feedback on this. They were asking for ideas on other administrative or regulatory changes that they could do outside of the legislative process. And then communication in this work is so important. I think you all know this, but having relationships, being able to try to get answers in a difficult environment where there is a lot of moving pieces, the ability to know who to follow up with and how to do that in a timely manner and get responses from these folks, being present is such a big part of that. And so the fact that we were able to go down as a group, bring these stories, have these meetings, and have these continued relationships is going to be helpful, has been helpful for the region, and will continue to be as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I want to highlight just a little bit about what you said. I know you and I are some of the newer members to participating more regularly in the network. And I know I've found it extremely valuable to benefit from the expertise of people who have been doing this type of advocacy, and folks like Polly, who also have worked within the legislative process and know some of those administrative burdens, regulations, but we were also really grateful to receive some philanthropic support for the network recently, in particular from Melville Charitable Trust here through our relationship in Connecticut, and some others. So we were able to, bring representation from the New England states to DC that was sort of funded through philanthropy and was a big support for us. So I just want to get that thank you out there and be grateful for that opportunity. And then we were able to also bring on some consultants who had worked within the process and knew who to call at which commission, how to get us from one building to the next in a matter of minutes and hop around. So I think it's that sort of historical expertise that I know I've really benefited from as being a part of the network, and then able to sort of bring our state expertise to the national conversation when we're able to set up those meetings and be a part of those personal relationships that have already existed has been really valuable. And then, Laura, I'd like to ask you to kind of dive in a little bit more to some of those follow-up pieces. So we go in and we kind of bring our state input that I think is really valuable to folks who may be detached from how some of these things maybe connect on the ground level with people who are experiencing housing instability or organizations experiencing some of the struggles in working with those folks. What has the network done kind of as follow up, and how do we kind of close that feedback loop and keep it going with the work that we did while we were in DC?
Yeah, thank you, Polly, Amy. Yeah, the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition has been involved with the New England Housing Network, but I was kind of new to the work, starting working there during COVID. And so this has been a great network to step into and leverage the expertise, but an area that we've been really concerned about at the federal level and wanted to take action around was BABA. And so in this trip to DC, we had a meeting with Dr. Mark Calabria, a high-level official at OMB, which oversees the Build America Buy America Act. And if you're not familiar, it requires federally funded housing projects to leverage supplies and manufactured products that are fully made in the US. We fully support kind of the intent and value behind something like that, but the reality of implementing it on projects that have 1,600 different little components, whether it's screws on a sink to the steel and elevator and switchgear parts, is really complicated, particularly when we're talking about having to submit waivers when those products are not found for each individual part. And so we had a good conversation with Dr. Calabria about that. He suggested we follow up with specific items that we knew were not going to be possible to find that were compliant with BABA. And we reached back out to all the New England partners and their developer teams to find out, okay, what are those products? And BABA is new, applying fully across these developments. But I put in the chat a letter that we sent of a follow-up, and it lists all of those key components that we were asking for a waiver on. We also highlighted that there's a new act. We were lucky enough to meet with Representative Flood from Nebraska in our trip down there, and he had submitted the Home Reform Act that exempts the home investment partnership funds from triggering BABA. But we were able to follow up and ask for that to cover other federal funds that impact housing projects and would trigger BABA. And so those are a couple of the key areas that we were able to follow up on. We have now gotten referred to the Made in America office and are trying to set up a follow-up meeting on that. But we were able to share, thanks to the expertise of folks around New England, this specific subcontractor, vendor, and general contractor costs that will increase. It's 5 to 10% from subcontractors. It's another $1,300 a month from GCs, or excuse me, a week for GCs. So all those costs are adding up at a time when the national government wants housing to be produced and needs housing. So it's really counter to the overall goal that we have as a nation to meet people's housing needs. So that is a much stronger message when shared from across New England than just one state. And I share that letter with you in the chat as something for you to consider sharing with your delegation as well. This is a national issue and it requires national engagement. So that's that.
Thank you so much, Laura. I think having been a part of that meeting in HUD, it was great to actually be in the HUD office, sit down across from several staffers working in different areas of the HUD portfolio, and where we might sit in our seats in New England and go, oh, okay, maybe this is something we can apply for a waiver for. And then you're talking to HUD staff and they're saying, oh, wow, we've really only got one waiver on one component through our process, and how lengthy and difficult that is to actually be successful and then ultimately in any way implicate housing being developed. So I think that's the power of this kind of coming together and being able to connect as a region. I'm wondering, I'd love to hear from each of you, sitting where you are in your particular New England state, what has been the value add to your work in taking a regional approach, in being able to kind of synthesize things at the national level and bring it back, or using the regional support that we've kind of put together and furthering your work. I'll just make a note that I know I haven't known a lot about rural housing in Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire in particular are very different than Connecticut in terms of having rural housing stock. However, I've learned that we do have rural housing stock in Connecticut, almost 9%. We're still kind of diving into that issue here. And I think being a part of NEHN has really helped us and me to understand and bring it back to our advocacy work. These are pieces that we also need to think about that are really valuable to our housing stock, and making sure that we're aware of the many resources that are available to this unique set of housing developments. I'd love to hear from each of you any of the value or particular learnings you've gotten from taking a regional approach and bringing it back to your individual work.
Amy, I just wanted to follow up, and Polly can speak to this too, but we met with USDA Rural Development, and though that is the funder of these rural 515 projects that are extremely prevalent in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and some you're sharing in Connecticut as well. But these were projects that were built decades ago, and their mortgages are timing out, and are extreme risk for being flipped into market rate housing and losing that affordable stock. They're frequently in very kind of nice areas on nice pieces of land, and they're attractive for being purchased and turned around for market rate. And so, Polly, you're an expert in this, but I think knowing what other states are doing on this, prioritizing it as a big concern. And there are some creative solutions that states are taking, working with PHAs and state assigned preservation dollars to save those properties.
I was going to say, look to Maine for their, which has a specific dedicated preservation tax credit for these properties. But I think when we're thinking about what is the value to Vermont of participating in this network, part of it is the access it grants us to these federal agencies in DC, whereas going as an individual organization, we might not be able to sit down with leadership at USDA Rural Development. Going as a full network, we were able to get that meeting. And the same with committee staff. You go down there as an individual organization and you tend to meet with your delegations, personal office staff, and those are really valuable, deep connections. But especially, it's really valuable to meet one step deeper into Capitol Hill with the committee staff, because these are the staff that are writing the bills. And to have that direct connection is really valuable and is what participating in a network allows us to have. And so if you look at the issue of rural preservation, the preservation of those USDA properties across New England, across the country, as Laura was saying, oftentimes these are some of the only rental properties, affordable properties in rural communities. They're immensely valuable, but they're from a national housing policy standpoint, a little bit niche. Going down as a network allowed us to sit down with leadership at USDA and get them excited about what rural development, that mission area within USDA could do for rural communities. The gentleman we sat down with said, "Hey, I'm really excited about how RD's programs could help strategic manufacturing in rural areas." And we're able to tell stories about how having affordable housing, it is the workforce housing for these rural economic drivers that they want to support. How our states, Vermont recently passed a new tax increment financing program that's going to help build out infrastructure. And for rural communities, the most affordable debt source for infrastructure is a USDA rural development debt source. So we're able to say, if manufacturing needs housing, it needs infrastructure, USDA programs are important for that. And you could see him during the meeting feeling excited about these programs, feeling ownership of these programs. And I think when administrative officials start having ownership, feeling ownership over the programs that they administrate, gets harder and harder to eliminate those programs. Rural development is something that's been zeroed out in, I think, every Trump budget. But to see a official who, if he's not politically appointed, is pretty close, being excited about those, I think that makes it one step harder to eliminate those and means that it is one step easier to work with RD to preserve these properties. And on the policy side, we're able to sit down with appropriations staff and also policy committee staff to emphasize the importance of the Rural Housing Reform Act, which is within that broader housing bill, the Road to Housing bill, that really focuses in on preserving rental assistance in properties after they exit the 515 program, after they've paid back their mortgage. Right now, the way the program works is that when they pay back their mortgage, the rental assistance goes away, and that really puts tenants in a double bind of possibly seeing increasing rents and losing their rental assistance. This bill it's called decoupling, separating the rental assistance from the mortgage and allowing that rental assistance to stay with the property while providing technical assistance to transition these properties to permanent affordability through nonprofit ownership. And so as being part of the network, we were able to have those meetings to emphasize the importance of this bill that, again, national perspective might be a little niche, but we were really able to talk about what it means for the communities that we work in.
I think that ability, I think Polly's point there around the ability to influence and share these stories and be part of the process is the value that we absolutely see, and I think is so critical. And that, it can feel, especially working in the States, especially in some of the smaller states too, like it can feel like the federal government and the federal policy changes are out of reach for us to be able to influence. They have a big impact, but can feel like how could we possibly have a seat at that table to be able to help voices up here be heard. And the reality is, like, this network and the ability to come down together and to share these stories is how we can go from a shelter in rural New Hampshire that is having a problem with accessing some program because of how they're structured. We can take that story through this network down to DC, to HUD, to bring it up. And it doesn't guarantee that it will be solved, but it guarantees that the story is being told in a way that often does not happen when you're not able to leverage regional relationships and bring it forward. And, I think the point Amy and Laura made too around the institutional knowledge, and for so many folks on here who probably may work at smaller nonprofits too, know that institutional knowledge and the ability to learn from each other can disappear when there's a staff transition or when someone moves on from a role they've held for a while. And the ability to have a network both in state and regionally helps make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel, that we're able to learn as a group and continue to be as impactful for you all as we possibly can.
I just chime in
jump in. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, well, I just was going to say, Maine has our Senator Collins on the Appropriations Committee, and we were able to meet with her staff. And it's not that we aren't already having conversations with that staff and her staff in general, but to be able to come in as a network is still more powerful. That this isn't just a main issue or a niche issue, because our senator needs to, on that committee, needs to be thinking about the broader view, and that provides that in kind of a trusted, safe environment. So that was helpful even from our kind of main delegation perspective as well.
I'll say
And I'll
the
just
neat
say
thing.
before turning it over to you, Nancy, just on that same issue, we met with Representative DeLauro's office when we were there, and forming those personal relationships that I think go beyond just the network and the committee that your representative is on, and then you have someone to kind of go back and forth with. And they appreciate having folks, I think, working in the community so they can get the sort of data or research that they need on the work that they hope to do. Nancy, go ahead.
Yes, you both connected some things I was thinking about as well, is that as a point person for our delegation in various locations and issues, I know if there's information they're looking for, I have a really broad reach to gather some of that information, right? Not just from my home state, but from the other states I work in and through the network from states we're not actively working in, so that we become, in that transfer of information, another even more valuable partner in terms of informing the delegation on issues and how it may be showing up in different geographies, different locations under different kinds of state policies and programs. So that's a great, just that strength of the network and this group. The other place I would just say is I've also experienced the generosity of the network in the sense of watching and learning about state-based programs or state-based initiatives, and being able to draw on the expertise that's developed within a state to bring to the states that I work in. And it's been everything from having a fellow network person either connect me with someone or they themselves coming and testifying, in the Vermont State House about a program they're doing because it's something that Vermont is considering. So that network has worked really well for us over the many, many years.
Thank you, Nancy. Thinking also about each of the states that you're working in, is there anything that a project that's unique to your location where you've seen the value in having a coalition to support you and perhaps find similarities in, so not just bringing something kind of back from your federal work, what are you doing locally where you can say, we have a coalition that's maybe doing something similar, or we have support here? Nancy?
Yeah, I mean, this is something very discrete, but we're working on an issue around making sure that the properties that we're involved in have stronger support from resident service coordination support. And as I look around at our 6 New England states, the policies and support and funding for that activity is very, very different. And in Vermont, there hasn't been a really strong vision or dedicated funding stream around resident service coordination. And we've been able to demonstrate and talk about that issue with policymakers, with foundations, with operators. As an owner and a tax credit syndicator, we've been able to delve into the portfolio data and show how resident service coordination benefits our residents, benefits the operations and the function of the property, its own performance. And so working on a topic like that, where we're trying to shape an approach on housing within a particular transaction or a portfolio of transactions, being able to turn to my colleagues and gather that data and information from groups and organizations in states that people are familiar with and that people are comfortable with, and pull that together has helped us to really advocate for and raise this topic in Vermont for all of our properties. And we're making a lot of good progress in that arena. And yeah, that's just like one I'm working on right now that comes to my mind as you ask that question. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you.
We
Anyone else?
Well, I just would say we look to other New England states for examples of state policy as well. And part of the reason for that is that our state legislators look to those as better kind of comps or comparisons than, say, California or Texas or something, as policies that could work well in Maine and would meet the needs of Maine people. Two specific examples I would use are policy around DEP permitting and timelines are something that we're looking at, that New Hampshire and Massachusetts are taking a lead on for housing development, and also housing resolutions boards or appeals boards. There's lots of different ways to describe that, but that's another policy area that we're looking at New England states for, and have found a lot of value in and generosity of the other states to share expertise and examples and strategy truly around how they do that work. I also just want to thank the Melville Foundation and whoever enabled all of us to go to Washington, D.C. on that trip through philanthropy. That was very generous of the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition. Probably wouldn't have been able to attend otherwise. And so we're just really grateful for the collaboration across the board on this.
Nick or Polly, anything that's happening locally for you all?
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked a little bit about the USDA piece, and I would just plus one that whole conversation because, especially in New Hampshire, trying to think about like how do we serve the whole state, and we know that where there's limited water and sewer infrastructure, and where you're dealing with some of the other challenges of rural development. The solutions that may work in Manchester or Nashua are different than what will work up by the Canadian border, right? And so being able to take some of those programs and serve our whole state with the knowledge and the expertise that the other network members have is huge. I think one thing that came to mind for me and just over the last couple of days has been the continuum of care notice of funding opportunity changes, especially as it relates to the 30% limit on the permanent supportive housing. And there's a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty has kind of been the name of the game over the last year plus in a lot of ways. And so while we don't always have the answer of sort of what exactly will this impact be, there is that sort of collective ability to work with our nonprofits and our continuums of care in the state to say, we're here, we're working across New England to leverage and try to meet with, as Laura mentioned, Senator Collins's team who's working on the appropriations bill, Senator Shaheen, Senator Hassan, where as folks probably saw, we're very involved in the CR negotiations and have been part of a group of folks who have been negotiating on a whole bunch of different proposals. And so the fact that we're able to take these concerns that are across the region, tell those stories to some of the folks who are making the policy decisions, and then at least have that trust that you're not alone in all of this. Mm-hmm. The CAHC changes have been sort of one that's front of mind, and where I'm really grateful of the regional network, so that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel or chase through every sort of public news story to figure out what's going on.
Yes, I will say that's something that I know we've connected to as well, kind of the comfort of having even just our membership email list being able to ask a question and, for example, most recently around projecting potential housing choice voucher losses depending on, the Senate or the House budget passing or continuing resolution. And there is kind of comfort in being able to work through these things with folks in other states that have said, oh, we've already done an analysis, this is how we do it, and it just kind of saves time and effort there. So I appreciate that kind of piece as well. Polly, did you have something to add?
Just going to build on that. And I think kind of a growth area and opportunity for this network is really diving into the state level implications of these policy changes and the information sharing there. But on an issue like the reduction in Section 8 vouchers, one of the strengths of the stories that we're able to tell is how housing programs are interconnected. And so we're able to think jointly about how to tell that story and have Brenda from Rhode Island talk about, okay, we are seeing a reduction in vouchers. This is what it's going to look like. But then also have Evernorth talk about this is how we use vouchers to develop deeply affordable units. And this is the importance of project-based vouchers that acting as a development source. So it's not just a rental source, it's now a development source. We're then able to make the connection back to the capital sources. How are we going to fully deploy housing trust funds that require deeply affordable units that need that rental source if we're pulling out that thread of rental assistance? And then make the connection for committee staff about the reconciliation package that passed this summer that increased the low-income housing tax credit program for the country. But that program requires gap financing, and part of that gap financing, again, is going to be debt leverage by project-based voucher or programs like the Housing Trust Fund. So we're just able to draw this complete circle about the interconnected nature of the housing programs in a way that's unique, helpful, and really helpful to kind of have those brainstorming conversations leading into that advocacy.
Thank you. As you all can see, Polly, it's great to have her at these tables because her expertise has been on both sides of the table, so it's really helpful. Are there any common hurdles that we've identified? We talked a little bit about BABA being Build America, Buy America being kind of a hurdle to development. Anything else that you all have thought through? And if not, I'm going to throw a little rose or thorn at you. Thorn being a hurdle, a rose being what could the New England Housing Network do in its next kind of projection moving forward? What could we do that we're not yet doing? And I heard some sprinkling of ideas today, but would love to hear any of those built out by you all as we think about kind of what's next.
I mean, I would a couple things that came to mind on sort of the common hurdle piece, and I think information and knowledge, sort of big picture, are huge for both the staff of delegation members who often may have an issue area expertise in some other part of government before they're coming into our delegation offices, and being able to both do some education there where folks want to be allies but need the knowledge of even things as basic as what is the total funding coming into our state as it relates to housing from all these different programs, and adding in the USDA programs and the HUD programs and the tax credit values. And so being able to paint that whole story across the state and sharing those information resources have been huge. I think the what Polly was mentioning about how the programs work together is also always a common hurdle, because the folks may decide, hey, we're going to make one sort of policy change over here, but not understand from what that means down the road when you're trying to fill that gap. And that's where having folks like Nancy and Evernorth who actually are seeing these projects through from the financing side is so helpful. And then I mean the other thing I would add around the common challenges is to sort of hit home the uncertainties around the layoffs. And, we talked about the staffing pieces early on. There were the appropriations bills, the budget shut down. And then, on the proactive side, like the road to housing bill. And, I think it sounds like many folks heard, more about that earlier in this conference, but seeing that there are also positive pieces, like it can be a little bit doom and gloom on many areas of some of this work today, but there are some real movement forward, and to be able to sell and celebrate those as well has been really helpful going forward.
Nick's comment.
Go ahead.
I'd say going down at a moment when Rhode was moving out of the Senate, when the House had some trepidation about it. It was a really exciting time to go down on housing policy at a time when it's the first major housing reform bill to pass out of the Senate in over a decade. And the kind of rose and thorn, two sides of the coin. I think all of us have really full plates on the state level advocacy work that we do, and we're really in the weeds, and it takes all of our time. And so it can be hard to have the bandwidth to fully participate in these federal conversations, even when there is an incredible federal opportunity like Road out there. And so to be working in a network that helps build our capacity, helps key us into these opportunities, brings us down to DC at just by chance a time when Road is on the move, was really a rose.
Go ahead, Laura. Thank you, Polly.
I lost my train of thought. I was agreeing so much with Polly. Sorry.
That's okay. We'll come back to you if it comes up. Nancy, any thoughts on the rose or thorn?
I guess I just want to note that this network is made up, and we said this at the beginning, and you brought it up, and it's shown here, but it's made up of organizations that are, deeply embedded in their states, are membership organizations that are gathering the information from the folks who are, here listening and with us, and that's a rose that, like, and it's been talked about a little bit here too, of just the value that the membership organizations bring to their members, and now through the network, that value rises even to different levels or different venues, which you might not expect or anticipate. That that I might be talking about something that someone's doing in Rhode Island that I learned about because I sit in the network. So that interconnectedness that Polly was mentioning around the funding is also true around all of us in our advocacy work and the experiences that we have in trying to support and affordable housing in our region. So for me, that's a big rose, and just a big thank you to each of the membership organizations that are doing this work and at the state levels.
I guess I wanted to share maybe the thorn is the historical lens of partisanship around housing, and trying to kind of work past that. The rose is that I think there's collective bipartisan agreement right now that housing is a priority issue for our nation, for our states. And that's what we need to be kind of leveraging and accelerating opportunities around that. I think any other than BABA, any deregulation seems to be of interest, and so that's the opportunity that we all need to be kind of focused on, and doing everything that we can to ensure up funding along the way.
Thank you all so much. If there are any participants here in our virtual space that have any questions for our panelists, I'd love to have you drop them in the chat. I'd be happy to get them to our panelists. I'll just say I love that as a potential closing thought, Laura, the partnerships that I think have been established throughout the network and throughout the states are going to be critical as we move forward in this tenuous environment where we're constantly waiting on information and shifting priorities. So I know we value it very much. And perhaps as a next step is just something that I'm gathering from our conversation today. An example of which is the letter, Laura, that you took the lead on putting together around highlighting BABA and some of the really strict regulations that go into that regulation and sort of being a hurdle to housing. But maybe that's where New England Housing Network can continue to step up in creating regional advocacy, having our name and the network become better known, and being able to put out kind of policy supports and statements as we move forward, where people realize that it's a body of experts from the New England states who are really covering all aspects of affordable housing development and stability. So just an idea that I'm kind of taking away from the conversation. But Nick, let me just look in the chat and see if we have anything. No questions. Well, Nick, Polly, Nancy, Laura, thank you all so much for your time today and for the great work that you each do in the communities that you represent and that you bring to the New England Housing Network. I've really enjoyed working with all of you and appreciate the conversation that you contributed today. So thank you so much. Thank you to all our participants. Please be sure to check out another session. We've got a couple more going today, lots to learn. We appreciate you being here. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.